My mother-in-law stood in the middle of my living room, looked around slowly, then turned to me and said, "You need to remember, you're just a guest here." And no one corrected her, not even my husband. He just sat there, eyes down, like I wasn't worth defending. And when she told me to move out of the master bedroom because family comes first, something inside me went completely still, not broken, just quiet, like a switch had flipped, and I nodded without saying a word. But they didn't know what that silence actually meant, and what happened next would change everything they thought they owned. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. I always read them, and it reminds me I'm not alone in this. My name is Claire Whitman. I'm 32 years old, and this was the night my own family tried to erase me from my own home, and the beginning of how I took it all back. But to understand why I didn't fight back that night, you have to go back to where it all started. The house sat just outside Seattle, about 20 minutes from downtown. 2 stories, pale gray siding, wide front porch, the kind of place that looked calm from the outside, like nothing bad could ever happen there. I had moved in 2 years earlier after marrying Ethan, and at first, it really did feel like home, quiet mornings, coffee in the kitchen, soft light coming through the windows, the kind of life I thought I had built carefully, patiently. But things started changing slowly. So slowly I almost didn't notice. His parents began visiting more often, then staying longer, then not leaving at all. And every time I tried to bring it up, Ethan would say the same thing. "It's temporary, Claire. Just give it time." But time didn't fix anything. It just made the lines blur. My kitchen became their kitchen. My living room became the family space. And little by little, I stopped feeling like I belonged anywhere in my own house. It wasn't loud at first, it was subtle. Comments dropped into conversations, small corrections, the way his mother would rearrange things I had just put down, or how his father would refer to the house as our place, even when I was standing right there. And I remember one afternoon I was setting the table, and she walked in, looked at the plates, and quietly moved them all, not saying a word, just fixing what she thought was wrong. And I stood there holding a fork, watching her, feeling something tighten in my chest, but I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that peace mattered more than being right. But peace started to feel like disappearing, and the more I stayed quiet, the more confident they became, until one night, everything shifted all at once. Dinner was loud, too loud, voices overlapping, laughter that didn't include me. I sat at the end of the table, barely speaking, just listening, watching. Ethan sat across from me, but he didn't look at me, not once. And that was the first moment something felt truly wrong, like I was sitting in someone else's life. And then his mother set her glass down, leaned back slightly, and said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "We've been talking, and it makes more sense if Claire moves out of the master bedroom." The room went quiet for half a second. Then his sister nodded, his father agreed, and I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, waiting, measuring, and I looked at Ethan just once, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. He just picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and avoided my eyes, and that silence said more than words ever could. "You understand," his mother added, softer this time, almost kind, but not really. "You're just a guest here after all." And there it was, out in the open, no more pretending, no more subtle hints, just the truth they had been building toward the entire time. And I could feel my hands starting to tremble under the table, so I placed them flat against my knees to keep them still. I didn't want them to see that reaction, not that part of me. And for a second, just a second, I thought about arguing, about telling them how wrong they were, about reminding them whose name was on the documents, whose signature was on every page. But something stopped me, not fear, not weakness, just clarity, a quiet understanding that saying anything in that moment would change nothing, because they had already decided who I was. So I nodded, just once, and said, "Okay," and the room relaxed instantly, like they had been waiting for that, like my agreement confirmed everything they believed about me. And his mother smiled, satisfied. His father leaned back in his chair, and Ethan still didn't look at me. And that was the moment I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. I wasn't losing my place in that house. I had already lost it, at least in their minds. I stood up slowly, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the room without another word. I could feel their eyes on my back, but no one stopped me. No one called my name. And as I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom they had just taken from me, the house felt different. Colder, like it had already moved on without me. And when I closed the door behind me, I didn't cry, I didn't break down. I just stood there, very still, looking around the room, taking in every detail, the dresser, the window, the bed I had chosen, the space I had built, and then my eyes moved to the corner, to a small locked drawer in the desk, and for the first time that night, I felt something else rise quietly inside me. Not anger, not sadness, something sharper, more focused, because they didn't know what I knew, they didn't know what my name was attached to, and they definitely didn't know what was about to happen next. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that drawer, my hand resting lightly on the desk like I was grounding myself. And for the first time that night, my breathing slowed down, not because I felt better, but because something inside me had shifted into focus, the kind of quiet that comes right before a decision. And I remember thinking very clearly, they have no idea. Then I reached down and pulled the drawer open, the lock clicking softly, almost too easily, and inside was the envelope I had not touched in months. Thick, slightly worn at the edges, my name printed across the front in clean, sharp letters, Claire Whitman. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of it in my hands, heavier than paper should feel, and for a second, I just held it there, remembering the day I first received it, because back then, I did not think it would ever matter like this. It had been a quiet afternoon, about 6 weeks before the wedding. My father sitting across from me at a small office downtown, the kind with neutral walls and a long wooden table, a legal office, calm and serious. He had insisted we meet there instead of at home, which already felt unusual. And I remember asking him why, half joking, but he did not smile. He just looked at me and said, "There are things you should understand before you get married." And at the time I thought he was being overly cautious, maybe even a little dramatic, because I was in love. And when you are in love, warnings sound like noise. But he did not rush. He explained everything slowly, clearly, with a lawyer sitting beside him, documents spread across the table, every page structured, every detail intentional. And I remember how he slid one paper toward me and tapped the bottom line. "This is the title," he said, "and this is your name." And I glanced at it, saw the address, the same house I would later move into. But back then, it was just another step in building a future with Ethan, not something I thought I would need to defend. "Why is it only under my name?" I had asked, and that was when he paused, leaned back slightly, and looked at me in a way I did not fully understand at the time. "Because marriage is about trust," he said, "but protection is about reality." And I remember feeling a little uncomfortable hearing that, like he was expecting something to go wrong, and I did not want to believe that. So I signed, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for him, thinking it was just a precaution, something that would sit quietly in the background of my life and never be needed. And now, standing in that room, months later, I realized just how wrong I had been. I opened the envelope carefully, sliding the documents out one by one, my eyes moving across the pages, confirming what I already knew but needed to feel again: the title deed, the ownership transfer, every line clean, every signature valid, everything legally tied to me, and me alone, not Ethan, not his parents, not anyone else, just me. And as I read, I could hear faint laughter from down the hallway, the sound of dishes, voices overlapping, life continuing as if nothing had changed, as if I had already stepped out of it. And that contrast hit me harder than anything else, how quickly they had erased me from a space I had built, but they did not know what was sitting in my hands. They did not know that the foundation they were standing on did not belong to them at all. I placed the documents back into the envelope, slower this time, more deliberate, then set it gently on the desk, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from acceptance, but the kind that comes from clarity. Like every piece of the situation had finally aligned in my mind, and I knew exactly what needed to happen next. I reached for my phone, hesitated for a second, then scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I had not used since that meeting months ago. The law firm. My thumb hovered over the call button, and I remember thinking, once I do this, there is no going back. Not to the version of this family I thought I had, not to the quiet compromises I had been making. This would change everything. And then I pressed call. The line rang twice before a calm voice answered, "Professional, steady," and I introduced myself. My voice even, controlled, giving my name, referencing the file number, and there was a brief pause on the other end, followed by recognition. "Yes, Miss Whitman," the man said. "How can we assist you?" And I took a small breath, glancing once more around the room, at the life that had just been taken from me without hesitation. And I said, "I need to review the ownership documents and understand my legal options regarding occupancy." And even as the words left my mouth, I could feel the shift becoming real, no longer just an idea, but a process already in motion. The conversation was brief, efficient. He explained that everything was clear. The ownership was solely in my name, and any occupants not listed had no legal claim to the property unless granted permission. And when he said that, I felt something settle firmly into place, because that meant one thing. Everything they had said, everything they believed about their control over that house, was built on nothing. We scheduled a meeting for the next morning, 9:30, downtown. And when I ended the call, the room felt different again. Not smaller, not colder, just mine. Completely, undeniably mine. I picked up the envelope, held it against my side, and walked toward the door, pausing just before opening it, because I could still hear them, still hear their voices, confident, comfortable, unaware, and for a moment, I imagined what would happen when that confidence cracked, when the truth finally reached them, not through argument, not through emotion, but through something they could not dismiss, something written, signed, enforced. And I did not smile. I did not feel satisfaction yet, just a quiet certainty, because what they had done that night was not just push me out of a room, they had given me a reason to stop holding back, and they still had no idea what was already set in motion. The next morning felt quieter than it should have, like the house itself was holding its breath, and when I walked into the kitchen, no one looked surprised to see me, which told me everything. They already expected me to adjust, to fall into whatever role they had decided for me overnight. My mother-in-law was standing by the counter pouring coffee into a mug that used to be mine. She did not even glance up as she said, "There is cereal in the pantry if you want something simple." Like I was a guest staying over for the weekend, and I paused just long enough to take that in, the small details, the way my place at the table had been shifted, the way my chair was now slightly off to the side, subtle changes, but intentional. And I nodded lightly, "Thank you," keeping my voice even, because reacting would only feed what they already believed, and I was not going to give them that. Ethan walked in a few seconds later, dressed for work, his tie slightly loose, his eyes flickering toward me for a brief second, before looking away again. And that was the part that stayed with me. Not anger, not confrontation, just avoidance, like he had already made peace with the version of events where I no longer mattered. And for a moment, I wondered if he would say anything, if there was still something left of the man I thought I married. But he just grabbed his keys, said a quick, "Morning," to the room, not to me, and left. And that silence confirmed what I needed to know. I ate quickly, not because I was hungry, but because I had somewhere to be. And as I walked out the front door, I could feel their eyes on me again, watching, measuring, assuming I was just stepping out to clear my head. None of them asked where I was going, and that was another mistake, because if they had asked, they might have realized sooner what was coming. The drive downtown took about 25 minutes. The sky overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything feel flat. And I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, not out of fear, but focus, replaying everything from the night before in my head, not emotionally, but logically, like I was organizing pieces into place, because this was not about proving a point anymore. It was about restoring something that had been taken without permission. The law office looked exactly the same as I remembered. Glass doors, clean lines, quiet lobby, the kind of place where things are decided calmly but carry weight. And when I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, checked my name, and asked me to have a seat. And as I sat there, I noticed how still everything felt. No raised voices, no tension, just structure, process, the opposite of what I had left behind at the house, and that contrast made everything clearer. A few minutes later, the same attorney from months ago walked out, recognizing me immediately, his expression professional but not surprised, as if he had expected this possibility all along. "Miss Whitman," he said, gesturing toward his office, and I followed him inside, closing the door softly behind me. The meeting was direct. No wasted time. He pulled out the file, opened it in front of us, and began reviewing the documents again, line by line, confirming ownership, confirming dates, confirming that everything was legally sound, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting him lay out the structure of what I already knew but needed reinforced, because this was no longer just information, it was leverage. And when he finished, he looked at me and asked a simple question: "Are the current occupants listed on any agreement?" And I shook my head, "No." And that was when he nodded once, decisive. "Then they are residing there without legal standing." And the way he said it was calm, almost routine, but the weight of it settled heavily, because it meant that everything that had happened in that house, every word, every assumption, every decision made without me, had no actual authority behind it. We discussed options, timelines, processes, and I chose the most direct path, not out of anger, but clarity, a formal notice, a defined period, everything handled through proper legal channels, no confrontation, no emotional arguments, just procedure. And as he explained the steps, I could feel the situation shifting from something personal to something structured, something enforceable, and that difference mattered. When I signed the necessary documents, my hand did not shake, not like the night before. It moved steadily, each signature deliberate, each line closing the gap between what they believed and what was actually true. And when it was done, he gathered the papers, assured me everything would be processed immediately, and that I would be updated as soon as the notice was served. And I thanked him, standing up, feeling lighter, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was now moving forward without needing their approval. The drive back felt different. The same roads, the same traffic, but my perspective had shifted, and when I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, unchanged, unaware, and I sat in the car for a few seconds before getting out, watching the front door, knowing that inside they were continuing their day as if nothing had changed, as if I had already stepped aside permanently, and for a brief moment, I wondered how long that illusion would last. When I walked inside, the atmosphere was the same, casual, comfortable, my mother-in-law sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, his father watching television, and neither of them acknowledged me beyond a quick glance. And I moved through the space quietly, placing my bag down, moving toward the smaller room they had assigned me. But this time, the feeling was different. I was not adjusting anymore. I was observing, measuring time, waiting for the moment when everything they thought was permanent would start to unravel. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized something with complete certainty. They still believed I had nowhere else to go, and that belief was about to cost them everything. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm, quiet on the surface but heavy underneath, like everything was waiting for something none of them could see. And I moved through the house differently now, not like someone trying to belong, but like someone taking mental notes. Every conversation, every look, every small decision they made without me. I noticed all of it, and what stood out the most was how comfortable they had become, how quickly they adapted to a version of reality where I no longer had any authority. My mother-in-law began making plans openly in the kitchen, talking about rearranging furniture, discussing repainting the walls, even mentioning bringing in her own pieces from storage, as if the house was already hers to reshape. And each time I heard it, I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper, not anger, not frustration, just confirmation. Ethan changed too, or maybe he had already changed and I was only now seeing it clearly. He stopped checking in with me completely. No messages during the day, no questions at night, just a polite distance, like we were sharing space out of convenience rather than connection. And one evening, as he stood by the hallway looking at his phone, I asked him calmly, "Do you really think I am just going to stay out of the way?" And he hesitated just for a second before answering, "I think it is easier if we all avoid conflict right now." And that word stayed with me. Easier. Not right, not fair, just easier. And I nodded slowly, because in a way, he was right. It was easier, just not in the way he meant. What they did not know was that everything was already in motion. The notice had been drafted, reviewed, and scheduled, and every passing day was simply a step closer to the moment it would reach them. But I did not rush it. I let time do its work, because the more comfortable they became, the sharper the shift would feel when it finally came. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found his parents discussing a family gathering they wanted to host, his mother listing names, talking about inviting extended relatives, neighbors, people who had never even stepped foot in that house before. And when she saw me, she paused briefly, then continued as if I was not part of the conversation. "We will need to clear some space in here," she said, gesturing around. "Make it feel more like home." And that word, home, landed differently this time. Not painful, not confusing, just misplaced, because they were building plans on something they did not own, and they had no idea how temporary it all was. I stayed quiet, sat down at the edge of the room, listening, watching, noticing how none of them questioned their position. Not once did anyone ask about ownership, about legal standing, about anything beyond their assumptions, and that was the part that surprised me the most. Not their behavior, but their certainty. Because certainty without foundation is fragile, and they were building everything on it. Later that night, I received an email from the attorney, short, precise, confirming that the official notice would be delivered within the next few days, and I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because it marked a shift from preparation to execution, and I closed my phone slowly, placing it beside me, feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle fully into place. This was no longer hypothetical, no longer a plan. It was real, and there was no stopping it now. The next morning, everything continued as usual, breakfast conversations, casual movements, the same routine they had settled into, and I could see it clearly now, how predictable it all was, how they had reduced me to something background, something temporary, and I wondered, briefly, how they would react when that background suddenly became the center of everything, when the structure they were relying on shifted under them without warning. Around midday, there was a knock at the door, firm but not aggressive, just official, and I heard it from down the hallway, my body stilling for a second, not out of fear, but recognition. This was it, and I did not move immediately. I let someone else answer. His father got up from the couch, muttering something about deliveries, and I stayed where I was listening, because I knew exactly what was about to happen, and then I heard it, the shift in his tone, confusion first, then something sharper. "What is this?" he asked, and a calm voice responded, steady, professional, explaining, and even from a distance, I could feel the change ripple through the house, like something invisible had just cracked open, and I closed my eyes briefly, not to escape it, but to take in the moment fully, because everything they believed about that house was about to be challenged in a way they could not ignore. And for the first time since that night at the dinner table, I allowed myself to feel something close to relief, not because it was over, but because the truth had finally arrived at their door. The front door stayed open longer than usual, and that alone told me something was wrong, or rather, something had finally gone right, because his father did not close it immediately the way he normally would. Instead, he stood there, holding a stack of papers in his hand, reading them too slowly, like his mind was struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing, and I could hear the faint voice of the man at the door, calm, neutral, repeating the same explanation in slightly different words, making sure everything was understood, and then there was silence, the kind that does not belong in a busy house, the kind that spreads quickly and pulls everyone into it. I stepped out into the hallway then, not rushing, not hesitating, just walking at a steady pace, and as I turned the corner, I saw them all gathered near the entrance, his mother standing just behind his father, her expression tight, confused, Ethan a few steps away, looking between them and the papers, and for a moment, no one noticed me, because all their attention was fixed on what had just been handed to them. "This has to be a mistake," his father said finally, his voice lower than usual, not angry yet, just uncertain, and the man at the door shook his head slightly, professional, composed. "Everything has been verified, sir. The notice has been issued in accordance with the ownership record," and that phrase landed heavily. Ownership record, like a word they had never actually considered before. His mother reached for the papers then, pulling them from his hands, scanning the first page quickly, her eyes moving faster as she read, and I watched the exact moment her expression changed. Not dramatic, not loud, just a small tightening around her mouth, a pause that lasted half a second longer than it should have, and then she looked up, directly at Ethan, not at me, not yet, and said, "What is this?" And that question carried more weight than anything she had said before, because it was no longer a statement, no longer an assumption, it was doubt. Ethan took the papers slowly, his movements careful, like he was trying not to disturb something fragile, and as he read, I could see the shift happen in him too, the way his posture straightened slightly, the way his jaw tightened, and for the first time since that night, he looked in my direction, not fully, just a glance, but enough, and in that brief moment, I knew he understood, at least partially, that something fundamental had been wrong in everything they believed. "Claire," he said, my name coming out more like a question than anything else, and the room seemed to hold on to that word, waiting for what would follow, and I stepped forward then, just enough to be fully in view, not dramatic, not confrontational, just present, and I said, calmly, "It means exactly what it says," and my voice did not shake. It did not rise, it stayed steady, because this was not the moment for emotion, this was the moment for clarity. His mother turned toward me fully now, her eyes sharper, searching. "You knew about this?" she asked, and I met her gaze without hesitation. Yes. And that single word shifted the balance in the room, because it confirmed something they had not even considered, that I had not been unaware, that I had not been powerless, that everything they had done had been based on a misunderstanding they never questioned. "This house," his father started, then stopped, looking back down at the document, reading again as if hoping the words would change, "is not under Ethan's name," he finished quietly, and that was when the silence deepened, not empty, but full, filled with the weight of realization settling into place. "It is under mine," I said, not interrupting, just completing the thought, and no one spoke for a second after that, because there was nothing left to assume, nothing left to interpret. The truth was clear, written, signed, delivered, and standing right in front of them. His mother took a small step back, not dramatically, just instinctively, like her body was adjusting to something it had not prepared for. And Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, the tension in his face shifting into something more complex. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to recognition, like pieces were finally connecting in a way he had avoided before. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, his voice quieter now, and I looked at him for a moment before answering, not immediately, letting the question sit. "Because the answer mattered. Because you had already decided who I was," I said, and there was no accusation in my tone, just fact. And that seemed to land harder than anything else, because it was not something he could argue with, not something he could dismiss. The man at the door cleared his throat lightly, reminding everyone of his presence, of the process that was still unfolding. "You will find all the details regarding the timeline and next steps in the notice," he said, maintaining the same calm professionalism. "If you have any questions, you may contact the office listed." And then he nodded once, stepping back, giving them space, and as the door closed behind him, the house felt different again, not quieter, but heavier, like the walls themselves had shifted slightly, adjusting to a new reality. His father sat down slowly on the nearest chair, the papers still in his hands, reading them again, more carefully this time, while his mother remained standing, her gaze moving between me and the document, trying to reconcile the two, and Ethan stayed where he was, not moving, not speaking, just processing, and I stood there, not triumphant, not relieved, just steady, because this was not about winning. It was about restoring something that had been taken without question, and now, for the first time, they were the ones without answers. No one moved for a few seconds after the door closed, and that stillness felt heavier than anything that had been said, like the house itself was adjusting to a truth it had not been built to hold, and I could see it in their faces. The slow shift from confusion to realization, the moment when assumptions stop feeling solid and start breaking apart. His mother was the first to speak again, her voice tighter now, controlled but strained. "This does not make sense," she said, looking down at the document again as if searching for an error. "We have been living here for months," and I nodded slightly, not disagreeing, because that part was true. "Yes," I said calmly, "you have," and that answer seemed to unsettle her, more than if I had argued, because it did not challenge her reality, it just reframed it. Then how is this possible? She pressed, her tone sharper now, and I could feel the room shift again, tension building in small, quiet ways, and I took a breath before answering. Not rushing, not reacting, just explaining, because living somewhere does not make it yours. And I kept my voice even, not cold, not emotional, just clear. And for a moment, no one responded, because there was nothing to push against in what I said. It was simple, factual, and impossible to dismiss. His father leaned forward slightly in his chair, holding the papers more carefully now, reading every line instead of skimming, his brows drawn together, his lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the moment he reached the section that mattered most, the ownership record, the name, my name, printed clearly, repeatedly, and he exhaled slowly, almost quietly, like something had just settled into place in his mind, something he could no longer argue with. Ethan finally stepped closer then, moving toward me in a way he had not in days, not aggressive, not confrontational, just uncertain, and he looked at me fully now, really looked, like he was trying to understand something he had overlooked for too long. "You never told me," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not anger, not exactly, but something more complicated, something closer to regret, and I held his gaze for a second before answering. "You never asked." And the simplicity of that response seemed to hit him harder than anything else, because it removed the possibility of blame shifting. It brought everything back to the choices that had already been made. The silence, the assumptions, the way he had chosen not to see what was right in front of him. His mother shook her head slightly, stepping closer to him, placing a hand lightly on his arm as if grounding herself. "This cannot just happen like this," she said, her voice lower now, less confident. "There has to be something we can do," and I watched her carefully, noticing how her posture had changed, the certainty gone, replaced by something more reactive, more uncertain, and I answered her the same way I had answered everything else, calmly, without escalation. The notice explains the process. I said, "You have time to make arrangements," and I did not add anything else, did not soften it, did not harden it, just stated it as it was, because the situation no longer required interpretation, it required acceptance. Ethan ran his hand across his forehead again, pacing once across the room before stopping, his movements sharper now, more restless. "This is not how this was supposed to go," he said under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else, and I heard that. I heard the expectation behind it, the version of events he had been following, the one where everything stayed simple as long as no one challenged it. And I realized then that for him, this was not just about the house, it was about the collapse of a narrative he had been relying on, the idea that avoiding conflict would somehow preserve stability, when in reality, it had just delayed the moment everything had to be faced. "What happens now?" his father asked finally, looking up from the papers, his voice steady again but different, more measured. And I appreciated that question, because it acknowledged reality instead of resisting it, and I answered him directly. "You review the notice, you follow the timeline, and you decide your next steps." And I kept my tone respectful, because despite everything, I was not trying to humiliate them. I was not trying to create a scene. I was restoring balance, and there is a difference. His mother let out a slow breath, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The furniture, the layout, the space she had already started to claim in her mind, and I could see the realization settling in her eyes, not all at once, but in pieces, the understanding that everything she had been planning, everything she had assumed was permanent, was now temporary, conditional, and that shift was not something she could control. Ethan stopped pacing then, standing still for a moment before speaking again, quieter this time. "Claire, why did you not say anything that night?" And the question was different now, not defensive, not dismissive, but genuine, and I looked at him for a second, considering it, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it in a way that would be heard. "Because nothing I said would have mattered to you," I replied, and there was no accusation in my voice, just truth. "You had already decided I did not belong here," and that sentence seemed to settle into the room more deeply than anything else, because it addressed the real issue, not the house, not the documents, but the moment they had chosen to redefine me without question. No one spoke after that, not immediately, and the silence that followed was different from before, not confused, not tense, but reflective, like something important had finally been understood, even if it was too late to undo it, and I stood there, not moving, not pressing further, because I did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been placed in front of them, not as an argument, not as a defense, but as a fact they now had to live with, and for the first time since that dinner, the balance in the room had shifted completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and they were the ones trying to figure out where they stood. The room did not return to normal after that, even though nothing else happened right away, and that was the strangest part. How everything looked the same on the surface, but felt completely different underneath, like the structure of the house had shifted in a way no one could ignore, and I could see it in the way they moved, slower now, more careful, like every step carried weight they had not felt before. His mother was the first to break away from the group, not abruptly, just a quiet retreat. She walked back toward the kitchen, placing the papers down on the counter with more care than before, as if they might change if handled differently, and I followed her with my eyes, noticing how she paused for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, her shoulders slightly tense, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not seem in control of the space around her. His father stayed seated, reading the notice again, slower this time, not searching for a mistake anymore, but trying to understand the implications, and Ethan remained where he was, standing in the middle of the room like he had not decided where he belonged, his eyes moving between me and the documents, like he was trying to connect two realities that no longer aligned. I stepped back slightly then, giving them space, not out of hesitation, but intention, because this moment was not about me explaining anything further. It was about them processing what had already been made clear. And there is a difference between being heard and being understood, and right now they were just beginning to understand. A few minutes passed like that, quiet, heavy, and then his mother spoke again from the kitchen, her voice lower now, less certain. "Ethan, did you know about this?" And the question hung in the air, not just directed at him, but at everything that had led to this moment, and he did not answer immediately, which in itself was an answer. He shook his head slowly, almost to himself. "No," he said, and there was something in that word, not just denial, but realization, like he was seeing how much he had not paid attention to, how many things he had assumed without question. "You should have known," she replied, not sharply, not accusing, just stating something that felt obvious now, and he let out a quiet breath, running his hand through his hair again. "I thought," he started, then stopped, and that unfinished sentence said more than anything complete ever could, because it revealed how much of this had been built on thought, on assumption, on choosing what was easier to believe instead of what was actually there. I watched him for a moment, not with anger, not even with disappointment anymore, just clarity, because the person I had been waiting for him to be had already shown me who he was, and this moment was not going to change that. It was only revealing it more clearly. His father finally set the papers down on the table, aligning them carefully, almost mechanically, like he needed to organize something to feel steady again. And he looked up at me, his expression calmer now, more composed. "How long have you known this would happen?" he asked. And it was a fair question, direct, grounded in reality, and I answered it the same way. "Since the night you asked me to leave the room," I said, and I saw the shift in his eyes when I said that, not shock, not exactly, but recognition, because that was the moment everything had started, the moment they had crossed a line they did not even realize existed. His mother turned back toward us then, her posture straighter now, as if she was trying to regain some sense of control. "So you planned this," she said, and I shook my head slightly. "No," I replied. "I responded to it, and that distinction mattered, because I had not created the situation. I had only acted within it. And the responsibility for how it unfolded did not start with me." Ethan looked at me again then, more directly this time. "You could have told me," he said, and there was something softer in his voice now, something that almost sounded like regret, and I held his gaze for a second before answering. "I gave you a chance to stand up for me," I said, "and you chose not to." And I did not raise my voice, did not push the words harder than necessary, because the truth does not need volume to be felt. The room fell quiet again after that, not empty, but settled, like everything that needed to be said had already been placed on the table, and there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to clarify, only the reality of what came next. His mother walked back into the room slowly, her steps more measured, and she looked around the space again, not with ownership this time, but with something closer to evaluation, like she was seeing it for what it actually was, not what she had assumed it to be. And that shift was subtle, but important, because it marked the beginning of acceptance, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. I moved toward the staircase then, not because I was leaving the situation, but because I had already said what needed to be said, and as I reached the first step, I paused for just a second, turning slightly back toward them, not to make a statement, not to deliver anything final, just to acknowledge the moment. And then I continued upstairs, the sound of my footsteps steady, controlled, each step reinforcing something that had been taken from me and was now firmly back in place. And as I reached the hallway, I realized something with complete certainty. The house had not changed, but the way it held all of us had, and from that moment on, nothing inside it would ever feel the same again. Upstairs, the air felt different, quieter, like the tension downstairs could not quite reach me anymore, and I closed the door behind me gently, not to shut them out, but to create space, a boundary that had not existed before, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to sit down without feeling like I was being watched or measured. I rested my hands on my lap, staring at the wall for a few seconds, not thinking about what had already happened, but about what was coming next, because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something they still did not fully understand. I could hear faint movement downstairs, voices lower now, no longer overlapping, no longer confident, just careful, and that shift told me more than anything they could have said, because it meant the balance had already changed, even if they had not accepted it yet. I stood up after a moment and walked toward the window, looking out at the street, the same quiet neighborhood, the same parked cars, everything outside unchanged, and that contrast grounded me, because inside the house, everything had shifted, but the world beyond it continued as if nothing had happened, and that reminded me that what mattered now was not the moment itself, but what I chose to do with it. A soft knock came at the door, not loud, not demanding, just hesitant, and I did not answer immediately. I let it sit for a second, then another, before saying, "Come in." And when the door opened, it was Ethan, standing there, his posture uncertain, like he was stepping into a space he was no longer sure belonged to him. And he closed the door behind him quietly, not fully, just enough to create a sense of privacy. He did not speak right away, just stood there, his hands at his sides, looking at me in a way he had not in a long time, not dismissive, not distracted, but searching, like he was trying to understand something that had already moved past explanation. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice low, steady but carrying something beneath it, and I nodded once because I believed that part. I believed he had not known the details, but that was not the point, and he seemed to sense that because he added, "I thought it was ours." And there it was again, that word ours, and I could see now how easily that assumption had been accepted, how little it had been questioned. "You thought a lot of things," I said quietly, not harsh, not cold, just honest, and he looked down briefly, his jaw tightening slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, like he understood that the conversation was no longer about correcting a mistake, it was about acknowledging a pattern. He took a step closer, then stopped, as if unsure how far he was allowed to go, and that hesitation said more than anything else, because it showed he felt the shift too, the space between us that had not been there before, or maybe had always been there, just unnoticed. "Why did you not say anything sooner?" he asked. And I could tell he was not asking for information. He was asking for something else, something like reassurance, something like a way back to the version of us he had been comfortable with, but I did not give him that, not because I wanted to punish him, but because it would not have been true. "Because you were not listening," I replied, and I kept my voice steady, not raising it, not softening it, just letting the words exist as they were. And he exhaled slowly, running his hand along the back of his neck, a small gesture, but familiar, something he did when he did not know how to respond. "I did not think it would go this far," he said after a moment, and I watched him carefully, because that sentence carried weight, not just in what it said, but in what it revealed, that he had seen the situation, had recognized it in some way, but had chosen not to act, had trusted that it would resolve itself without requiring him to step in, and that was the part that mattered. "It did not go far," I said quietly. "It just became visible." And he looked at me then, really looked, like he was hearing something he had not expected, and for a second, there was silence again. But this time it was different. Not heavy, not tense, just clear, like everything had been laid out in a way that could not be undone. Downstairs, I could hear his parents moving again, slower now, the sound of drawers opening, cabinets closing, small adjustments, and I knew what that meant. Not fully, not yet, but enough. They were beginning to respond. Not emotionally, not loudly, but practically. And that was the first real sign that the process had begun. Ethan glanced toward the door briefly, then back at me. "They are trying to figure out what to do," he said, and I nodded slightly. "They should," I replied, and there was no edge in my voice, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement, because that was exactly what needed to happen. They needed to understand that this was not a moment. It was a change in direction. He shifted his weight slightly, like he was about to say something else, then stopped, and I could see the conflict in him, the part of him that wanted to fix things, to smooth everything over, to return to something familiar, and the part that was starting to realize that some things do not go back once they have been seen clearly. "Claire," he started, then paused. And I waited, not encouraging, not stopping him, just letting him decide whether to continue. And after a moment, he did not. He just nodded slightly, like he understood something without needing to say it out loud, and that was enough. He turned then, opening the door quietly, and before stepping out, he hesitated for just a second, his hand resting on the handle, and I could feel that pause, the weight of everything unspoken between us, but I did not fill it. I did not offer anything to ease it, because this was not a moment to soften, it was a moment to hold steady. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a second longer, then moved back toward the window, looking out again, the same quiet street, the same stillness, and I realized something in that moment with complete clarity. This was no longer about proving anything to them. It was about deciding what I was willing to accept moving forward. And for the first time since everything began, that decision felt entirely mine. That evening, the house felt unfamiliar in a way that was hard to explain, not because anything had physically changed, but because the energy inside it had shifted into something quieter, more cautious, like everyone was moving around an invisible line they did not fully understand yet. And I could hear it in the small things, the way cabinets were closed more gently, the way footsteps slowed near the hallway, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, not out of respect, but uncertainty. I stayed upstairs longer than usual, not avoiding them, just allowing space to settle, because I knew this part mattered, not the confrontation, not the moment of reveal, but what came after, when people had to adjust to a truth they could not ignore. Eventually, I walked back downstairs, not announcing it, just moving naturally, and when I stepped into the living room, his parents were sitting together on the couch, the notice spread out on the coffee table between them, multiple pages now separated, highlighted in places, like they had been going through it carefully, line by line, and Ethan was standing near the window, his arms crossed, looking out, not turning when I entered, but I knew he was aware I was there. His mother looked up first, her expression different now, not cold, not dismissive, just measured, and she straightened slightly as I approached, as if preparing for something more formal. "We have been reviewing this," she said, gesturing lightly toward the papers, and I nodded once. "I expected you would," I replied, and my voice stayed calm, steady, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about moving forward with clarity. His father leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together, the papers now organized into a neat stack in front of him, and he looked at me directly, not with challenge, but with intent. "The timeline says we have 30 days, he said, and I nodded again. "That is correct." And there was a pause after that, not uncomfortable, just deliberate, like he was considering his next words carefully. "We did not know," he added, and there was something in the way he said it, not defensive, not pleading, just factual, and I acknowledged that with a small nod, because I understood that part, but understanding did not change the situation, and he seemed to recognize that too, because he did not push further, he just sat back slightly, processing. His mother glanced at Ethan briefly, then back at me. "This changes things," she said, and I noticed the shift in her tone. Not authoritative anymore, not certain, just acknowledging reality, and I responded simply, "Yes," because there was nothing else to add. It did change things, completely. Ethan finally turned from the window then, his gaze moving between all of us before settling on me, and there was something steadier in him now, not resolved, but clearer, like he had accepted that this was not something he could avoid anymore. "What do you want to happen?" he asked, and that question carried weight, not because of what it asked, but because of what it implied, that he was finally recognizing my position in all of this, not as someone to be managed, but as someone with authority. I took a moment before answering, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to be precise. "I want the terms of the notice to be respected," I said, and I kept my voice even, not demanding, not emotional, just clear. And he nodded slowly, like he expected that answer, even if he had hoped for something else. His mother shifted slightly, her hands resting on her lap now, her posture more composed. "And after that?" she asked, and I met her gaze directly. "After that, we all move forward," I said, and I did not elaborate, because the specifics were not something I was going to define for them. That part would depend on their choices, not mine. There was another pause, longer this time, and I could see them processing not just the situation, but their place within it, the roles they had assumed, the positions they had taken, and how those no longer aligned with reality. And that kind of adjustment does not happen all at once. It happens in pieces, quietly, over time. His father stood up then, slowly, smoothing his shirt as he did, a small, habitual gesture, and he looked at the room differently now, not with ownership, not with expectation, just awareness, and that was the first real sign of change. Not in words, but in perception. Ethan stepped slightly closer to me, not too close, just enough to be part of the conversation rather than observing it from a distance, and he spoke again, quieter this time. "I should have handled things differently," he said, and I looked at him for a moment, not immediately responding, because that statement, while true, did not undo what had already happened, and after a second, I nodded once. "Yes," I said, and left it there, because anything more would have turned it into something else, something softer, something that might blur the clarity we had finally reached, and I was not willing to do that. His mother glanced between us, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she looked down at the papers again, adjusting them slightly, aligning the edges. A small action, but one that reflected the larger shift, the move from assumption to structure, from control to response. The house remained quiet after that, not empty, but settled into something new, something that did not rely on old roles or unspoken expectations. And as I stood there, taking it all in, I realized that this moment was not about what had been taken from me. It was about what had been returned, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And for the first time since everything began, there was no question left about where I stood, not in their eyes, but in my own. The next few days unfolded in a way that felt almost surreal, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything became quieter, more deliberate, like the house itself was adjusting to a new set of rules no one had formally agreed to, but everyone now understood. And I could see it in the way his parents moved through each room, no longer rearranging things, no longer making casual changes. Instead, they paused, before touching anything, like they were suddenly aware that nothing around them was truly theirs to control. I noticed his mother one morning standing in the kitchen, her hand hovering over a cabinet handle before she slowly pulled it open, carefully, almost respectfully. And that small shift said more than any apology could have, because it showed awareness, not just of the situation, but of the boundary that had been invisible before. His father spent more time reviewing the notice, sitting at the dining table with his reading glasses on, going through each line again, not searching for a way out anymore, but trying to understand what needed to be done next. And occasionally he would make notes on a small pad, writing down dates, timelines, steps, treating it like something real, something that required action rather than denial. Ethan changed too, not suddenly, not in a way that fixed anything, but in small, noticeable ways. He started speaking more carefully, choosing his words instead of letting silence fill the gaps. And one evening, as we stood in the kitchen at the same time, he asked, "Do you need anything?" And the question itself felt unfamiliar, not because of the words, but because of the intention behind them, and I looked at him for a second before answering, "No," keeping it simple, because I was not going to rebuild something that had already shown its cracks without understanding what those cracks meant. Conversations in the house became more structured, less casual, as if everyone was aware that every word now carried weight. His mother would ask before making plans. His father would confirm details before assuming anything, and even simple things like meals or shared spaces were discussed, rather than taken for granted. And while on the surface it might have looked like cooperation, I knew it was something else. It was adjustment, the process of recalibrating to a reality they had not prepared for. One afternoon, his mother approached me directly, not in the middle of a group, not with an audience, just the two of us standing near the hallway, and she paused for a moment before speaking, like she was choosing her words carefully. "We have started looking at other places," she said, her voice steady, and I nodded once, acknowledging it. "That is a good idea," I replied, and there was no tension in the exchange, no underlying conflict, just information being shared, because at this point, the situation no longer required emotion, it required movement. She hesitated slightly, then added, "We did not realize," and she stopped there, not finishing the sentence, but I understood what she meant, and I did not press her to complete it, because sometimes what is left unsaid carries more meaning than what is spoken, and I simply nodded again, letting the moment pass without forcing it into something it was not ready to become. Later that evening, Ethan and I found ourselves in the living room alone, the house quieter than usual, his parents upstairs, likely going through listings or making calls, and he sat across from me, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together, and for a moment, he did not speak, just looked at me, like he was trying to find the right place to start. "I keep thinking about that night," he said finally, his voice low, thoughtful, and I remained still, listening, not interrupting, because I wanted to hear what he would say without influence. "I should have said something," he continued, and there was no defensiveness in his tone now, no attempt to justify or redirect, just acknowledgement, and I nodded once, because that part was true, but it was also already in the past. "I thought keeping things calm would help," he added, and I could hear the realization in his voice, the understanding that calm is not always the same as right, and I answered him quietly. It only helped until it did not, and that seemed to land with him, because he nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what I meant. We sat there for a moment in silence, not uncomfortable, just reflective, and I could feel the space between us still present, still defined, but no longer ignored, and that difference mattered, because acknowledgement is the first step toward anything changing, even if it does not guarantee that it will. As the days continued, the timeline of the notice moved forward steadily, not rushed, not delayed, just progressing as it was designed to, and I could see the effects of it in everything around me. Boxes beginning to appear in the hallway, small at first, then more, items being sorted, decisions being made, not dramatically, not with resistance, but with a quiet acceptance that had replaced the earlier certainty. And that shift was the most significant change of all, because it showed that the reality had been fully understood, not just intellectually, but practically. One morning, as I walked through the living room, I noticed a stack of folded blankets near the couch, neatly arranged, ready to be packed, and I paused for a second, taking in that detail, not because it was important on its own, but because it represented something larger, the transition from assumption to action, from belief to reality. And I realized then that this process, while difficult, was also necessary, not just for them, but for me, because it clarified something I had not fully understood before, that standing up for myself was not about creating conflict, it was about restoring balance. And once that balance was restored, everything else had to adjust around it, whether anyone was ready or not. By the second week, the house no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a place in transition, every room carrying small signs of change, not dramatic, not disruptive, just steady, deliberate movement towards something inevitable. And I could see it in the way the boxes had multiplied, stacked neatly along the hallway, labeled in careful handwriting, kitchen, books, personal items, each one a quiet acknowledgement that their time there was coming to an end. His mother moved differently now, no longer directing the space, no longer adjusting things as she passed by. Instead, she focused on sorting, organizing, deciding what would go where, her energy redirected into something practical, and there was a calmness to it. Not acceptance exactly, but a kind of measured understanding that resisting it would not change the outcome. His father spent more time outside on the porch, sitting in the chair that overlooked the street, papers still in hand, but now he read less and observed more, watching cars pass, people walking by, as if grounding himself in something steady while everything inside shifted. Ethan kept his distance, not avoiding me, but not stepping too close either, like he was still trying to find the right position in a situation that had moved beyond his control. And occasionally, he would start a conversation, small, careful attempts to reconnect, asking about things that used to feel normal, but now felt different, and I responded politely, not shutting him down, but not opening doors that had already closed either. One afternoon, as I walked into the dining area, I noticed something that made me pause. The table had been cleared of everything except a single folder, placed neatly in the center, and his father was standing beside it, waiting, not impatient, not tense, just present. And when he saw me, he gestured slightly toward the chair across from him. "We need to go over a few things," he said, his voice steady, and I nodded, taking the seat without hesitation, because I understood what this was. Not a confrontation, not a negotiation, but a final alignment of details. He opened the folder slowly, revealing a set of printed documents, notes, and a list of dates, and he began explaining what they had arranged, where they would be moving, how they planned to handle the timeline. Every point clear, structured, and I listened carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just absorbing the information, because this was not about control anymore. It was about closure. His mother joined us shortly after, sitting quietly beside him, her posture composed, her expression calm, and for the first time since everything began, there was no tension in her presence, no underlying resistance, just focus, and that shift felt significant, because it meant the process had moved beyond reaction into acceptance. "We will be out before the deadline," his father said finally, looking up at me, and I nodded once. "That works," I replied, keeping it simple, because there was no need to complicate what was already clear. There was a brief pause after that, and then his mother spoke, her voice softer than before. "We did not handle things well," she said, and the words were not elaborate, not detailed, but they carried weight, because they were direct, and I met her gaze, acknowledging it with a small nod, not dismissing it, but not expanding on it either, because apologies do not undo actions, they only recognize them. Ethan stood nearby, listening, his arms relaxed at his sides, and when his mother finished, he stepped slightly closer, not interrupting, just present, and I could see the shift in him too, the way he was no longer trying to manage the situation, but simply exist within it, and that was a change I had not expected. "I understand," I said after a moment, and my voice remained steady, not emotional, not distant, just clear, because understanding does not mean agreement, and it does not mean forgetting. It simply means acknowledging what is real. The conversation moved forward after that, practical, focused, timelines confirmed, logistics clarified, and when it ended, there was no dramatic conclusion, no final statement, just a quiet agreement that everything was now aligned. And as I stood up from the table, I realized that this was the moment the situation truly shifted, not when the notice was delivered, not when the truth was revealed, but here in this calm, structured conversation, where everything that had been uncertain was now clearly defined. Over the next few days, the house continued to change. More boxes, fewer personal items, and spaces opening up, and with each small shift, the atmosphere became lighter, not because the situation was easy, but because it was moving forward, and movement, even difficult movement, creates clarity. One evening, I walked through the living room and noticed that the couch was no longer filled with their belongings. The surfaces were clear, the space more open, and I paused for a moment, taking it in, not with relief, but with recognition. This was the house returning to what it had always been, just without the confusion that had clouded it before. Ethan stood near the doorway, watching as I looked around, and after a moment, he spoke, his voice quieter now, more grounded, I did not realize how much I was ignoring, he said, and I turned slightly toward him, considering that because it was true, but it was also something he had to carry, not something I could resolve for him. You see it now, I replied, and he nodded slowly, not defensively, not with resistance, just acknowledgement. And that was enough, because this was not about fixing what had happened, it was about understanding it. And understanding is what allows something different to exist moving forward. As the final days approached, the house felt almost peaceful, not empty, not disconnected, just settled, like everything had found its place again. And as I stood there, looking around at the space that had once felt uncertain, I realized that what had been restored was not just ownership, but something deeper, something quieter, the sense that I no longer needed to question where I stood, not in this house, not in this life, and that clarity was something no one could take away again. The house felt different in the days after they left, not empty, but finally still, like it could breathe again. And I remember walking through each room slowly that first morning, not rushing, not looking for anything specific, just noticing the quiet, the way the light came through the windows without interruption, the way every object stayed exactly where I had placed it. And for the first time in a long while, nothing felt uncertain, nothing felt like it could be taken from me without my voice being heard. The master bedroom was the last place I walked into, and I paused at the doorway for a moment, remembering that night, the words that had been said so casually, so confidently, and how I had stood there, choosing silence, not because I was weak, but because I understood something they did not, that sometimes you do not need to fight in the moment when you already hold the truth. And as I stepped inside, I did not feel anger, I did not feel victory, I just felt grounded, like I had returned to something that had always been mine, not just the space, but my sense of self. Ethan moved out a few days later, not abruptly, not dramatically, just quietly, like everything else that had followed. And we did not have a long conversation about it. We did not try to fix something that had already revealed its foundation. We simply acknowledged what was true, and sometimes that is the most honest form of closure you can have. Life after that was not perfect. It did not suddenly become easy or simple, but it became clear, and there is a kind of peace that comes with clarity, even when it is not comfortable, because you are no longer guessing, no longer adjusting yourself to fit into something that does not respect you. You are simply standing where you belong, without apology. I learned something through all of this that I did not fully understand before, that boundaries are not about pushing people away, they are about protecting what is yours, your space, your voice, your dignity. And the moment you allow someone to redefine your place in your own life, even in small ways, you begin to disappear, not all at once, but piece by piece. And the hardest part is not realizing it until it has already happened. If you are listening to this, and something in your life feels off, something small but persistent, something that makes you question your place, trust that feeling. Your intuition is not there to confuse you. It is there to protect you, and ignoring it will not make things better. It will only delay the moment you have to face what is already true. Protect your name, protect your finances, protect your space, not out of fear, but out of self-respect, because love should never require you to give up your foundation, and respect should never be conditional on your silence. There is also something I came to understand about forgiveness. It is not about excusing what happened. It is about releasing the weight of it so it does not follow you into the next chapter of your life. And for me, that meant letting go of the version of people I thought they were and accepting who they showed themselves to be, without trying to change it, without trying to rewrite it. I believe that sometimes God, or the universe, however you choose to see it, puts you in situations that feel unfair, not to punish you, but to reveal something you would not have seen otherwise, something about your strength, your worth, your boundaries, and it is up to you whether you listen or not. Today, my life is quieter, more intentional, not built on assumptions, but on awareness, and while it may not look perfect from the outside, it feels right on the inside, and that is something I would not trade for anything. If you have stayed with me through this story, thank you, truly, because sharing something like this is not easy. But knowing that someone out there might hear it and feel less alone, that makes it worth it. And if any part of this resonated with you, if it reminded you of something you are going through or something you have been trying to ignore, I hope you take a moment to acknowledge that, to honor it, and to take even a small step toward protecting yourself, because you deserve that much. If you want to share your story, or simply tell me where you are listening from, I would love to read it. And if this meant something to you, you can support by liking or subscribing, but only if it feels right to you. My name is Claire Whitman. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is this: never let anyone convince you that you are a guest in your own life.